January 17, 1943. 23,000 feet above the Kiel shipyards, northern Germany. The air inside the B-17 bomber Yankee Doodle was thin enough to kill a man in minutes. Outside, the temperature hovered at 40 degrees below zero. Ice crystals formed on the rivets of the fuselage, and the oxygen masks of the 10-man crew hissed rhythmically, the only sound louder than the droning roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines. Staff Sergeant James "Jimmy" Ward, the flight engineer, crouched in the cramped radio compartment, his gloved hands working a wrench over a fuel line that had begun to weep precious gasoline into the freezing air. Around him, the bomber shuddered as flak burst in black puffs, each concussion a reminder that death was measured in fractions of inches and seconds. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ward, we need that engine running or we're not making it home." Jimmy didn't answer. He was already moving. Outside the aircraft, somewhere in that crystalline void, 109 circled like wolves. Inside, the smell of hydraulic fluid mixed with the metallic tang of fear. This was not a place for hesitation. This was not a place for the faint of heart. And yet, in this freezing, hostile sky, men like Jimmy Ward did the impossible, not once, but again and again, repairing catastrophic damage to aircraft mid-flight, under fire with nothing but nerve, skill, and an American wrench. The story of the flight engineer, the mad mechanics of the Army Air Forces, is not one that history remembers with the same reverence as the aces, the bombardiers or the Medal of Honor recipients. But without them, the entire strategic bombing campaign over Europe would have collapsed before it ever began. These men were not merely technicians. They were magicians of metal, priests of the internal combustion engine, and in the crucible of combat they became something more, symbols of American ingenuity, determination, and a strange, unshakable faith in the machinery of democracy itself. By the winter of 1943, the Allied bombing campaign over Nazi-occupied Europe had entered its most brutal phase. The 8th Air Force, operating out of bases across England, was hurling itself against the industrial heart of the Third Reich: factories, rail yards, U-boat pens, and oil refineries. The doctrine was simple: daylight precision bombing unescorted deep into enemy territory, relying on the defensive firepower of massed bomber formations and the rugged design of aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. The reality was catastrophic. Loss rates soared above 10% per mission. Statistically, a crew had only a 1 in 4 chance of surviving a full tour of 25 missions. Aircraft returned riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, engines shot out, hydraulic systems shredded, control surfaces hanging by threads. And yet many of them returned at all only because of men like Jimmy Ward. The flight engineer was the most technically skilled enlisted man aboard a heavy bomber. He sat behind the pilots during takeoff and landing, monitoring a bewildering array of gauges: fuel pressure, oil temperature, manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature, RPM. He managed fuel transfer between tanks to maintain balance and range. He operated the top turret, a twin 50 caliber machine gun emplacement that made him both mechanic and gunner. And when things went wrong, when an engine caught fire, when a fuel line ruptured, when a hydraulic pump failed, he went to work, often in conditions that defied belief. The German High Command had studied American bombers with the meticulous care of surgeons. They knew the weaknesses: the lack of fighter escort beyond the French coast, the predictable formations, the vulnerability of engines to 20mm cannon fire. Luftwaffe pilots were briefed to target the engines first, then the cockpit, then the fuel tanks and the wings. Flak batteries were positioned with mathematical precision, creating boxes of explosive fragmentation at altitudes between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, exactly where the bombers had to fly to drop their payloads accurately. The Germans expected the Americans to break. They expected the loss rates to force a strategic retreat, a return to night bombing like the British, or perhaps an abandonment of the air campaign altogether. What they did not expect was the mechanic. What they did not expect was a man who would crawl out onto the wing of a bomber at 200 miles per hour, 20,000 feet above enemy territory, in sub-zero temperatures to beat out an engine fire with his bare hands. What they did not expect was a culture that taught every crew member to improvise, adapt, and fix things with whatever was on hand. A culture born not in military academies, but in American garages, farms, and factories, where young men grew up taking apart tractors, jalopies, and radios, and putting them back together again. April 5, 1943. Over Bremen, Germany. The B-24 Screaming Eagle was 3 hours into its mission when the No. 3 engine took a direct hit from a Messerschmitt's cannon. The cowling exploded in a spray of metal and oil, and flames erupted from the engine nacelle, licking back along the wing toward the fuel tanks. The pilot, Captain Daniel O'Hara, felt the yoke shudder in his hands. Fire in the air was the nightmare every bomber crew feared most. Unlike a car or a tank, you couldn't pull over. You couldn't bail out and hope the fire burned itself out. You were trapped inside a flying fuel tank, and if the flames reached the main wing tanks, the entire aircraft would disintegrate in seconds. Technical Sergeant Roy Sparky Henderson, the flight engineer, didn't wait for orders. He unhooked his oxygen line, grabbed a fire extinguisher, and crawled into the bomb bay catwalk, then out through the narrow access hatch onto the wing. The slipstream hit him like a freight train. The wind at that speed and altitude was not just fast, it was solid, a wall of force that could rip a man off the wing and hurl him into the void. Sparky clipped his safety harness to a wing strut, dragged himself forward on his belly, and aimed the extinguisher at the base of the flames. The fire extinguisher lasted 12 seconds. The flames didn't stop. Sparky crawled back inside, his face blue from hypoxia, his hands numb. He grabbed a wool blanket from the waist gunner's position, soaked it in coffee from a thermos, and went back out onto the wing. This time he beat at the flames with the blanket, smothering them section by section, his lungs screaming for oxygen, his vision tunneling. The slipstream tore the blanket from his hands once, and he had to drag himself back inside to get another. On his third trip, the fire finally died. The engine was destroyed, but the wing was intact. Screaming Eagle limped home on 3 engines, and Sparky Henderson was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation read, "For extraordinary achievement in aerial flight." It did not mention that he had saved the lives of 10 men while technically breaking every safety regulation in the Army Air Forces manual. The Allied commanders knew the stories. They heard them in debriefing rooms, read them in after-action reports, watched them play out in the gun camera footage reviewed by intelligence officers. They knew that flight engineers were performing acts of mechanical heroism that bordered on the insane. And they knew something else. The Germans had nothing like it. The Luftwaffe had excellent pilots, superior aircraft in many respects, and experienced ground crews. But their doctrine did not empower individual initiative the way American doctrine did. German mechanics worked on aircraft on the ground, under supervision, following technical manuals to the letter. The idea of a crew member improvising a repair at altitude, under fire, using tools and materials not specified in any manual, was antithetical to the rigid hierarchy and procedural discipline of the Wehrmacht. The Americans, by contrast, had inherited a frontier ethos, a cultural belief that problems were meant to be solved by the people closest to them, using whatever was at hand. It was the ethos of the barn-raising, the circuit-riding preacher, the small-town mechanic who kept the thresher running with baling wire and ingenuity, and it was devastatingly effective. June 22, 1943. Over the North Sea, returning from a raid on the Ruhr Valley, the B-17 Sweet Lorraine was dying. 2 engines were out, the hydraulic system was shot to pieces, and the aircraft was losing altitude at a rate of 300 feet per minute. The crew had already jettisoned everything not bolted down: ammunition, flak vests, even the .50 caliber machine guns from the waist positions. The pilot, Lieutenant Howard "Howie" Grant, was nursing the controls, coaxing every last ounce of lift from the crippled bomber. The navigator calculated they had maybe 10 minutes before they'd have to ditch in the North Sea, a death sentence in water that cold. In the cockpit, Sergeant Michael "Mick" Sullivan, the flight engineer, was staring at the fuel pressure gauge for engine number 4. It was fluctuating wildly, dropping to 0 and then spiking back up. A fuel line was damaged somewhere in the nacelle, probably leaking, possibly about to fail completely. If they lost engine 4, they were in the water. No question. Mick unbuckled, grabbed his toolbox, and told the pilot, "I'm going out." Howie looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Out where?" "The catwalk. I can reach the engine nacelle from underneath." There was no catwalk to the engines. There was a narrow maintenance access panel in the bomb bay, designed for ground crews to service the engines while the aircraft was parked. It was never intended to be opened in flight. Mick opened it anyway. He clipped a safety line to his belt, lowered himself through the access panel, and hung suspended in the slipstream beneath the aircraft, his legs dangling in space, the North Sea a gray blur 8,000 feet below. The wind was so loud he couldn't hear his own thoughts. He reached up into the engine nacelle, felt along the fuel line until he found the rupture, a split seam weeping gasoline, and wrapped it with friction tape from his toolkit. His hands were so cold he couldn't feel his fingers. He wrapped the tape by memory, by instinct, by sheer force of will. When he pulled himself back into the bomb bay, his flight suit was soaked with gasoline, his face was frostbitten, and his hands were bleeding. Engine 4 stabilized. Sweet Lorraine made it back to base. Mick Sullivan never received a medal. His commanding officer wrote him up for a reprimand for violating safety protocols. The symbolic weight of these acts was not lost on the men who witnessed them, nor on the military historians who would later study them. The flight engineer, hanging beneath a bomber over the North Sea repairing an engine with friction tape, became a kind of parable. He was the American everyman, resourceful, stubborn, unimpressed by authority, willing to risk everything for his crew. He was the farmer who kept the tractor running through harvest season, the factory worker who improvised a tool when the production line broke down, the garage mechanic who could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone. And he was the antithesis of everything the Axis powers represented. The Germans built machines with Teutonic precision, engineered to exacting standards, maintained by specialists who followed orders. The Japanese built aircraft around the philosophy of spiritual purity and self-sacrifice, expecting pilots to accept death as a matter of honor. The Americans built machines that could be fixed with a wrench and a prayer, and they trusted ordinary men to keep them flying. It was a philosophy born of abundance. America had steel, aluminum, rubber, oil, and trained manpower in quantities the Axis could only dream of. But more than that, America had a culture that believed in the individual's ability to solve problems, to take initiative, to make do. The flight engineer was not just a technician. He was a manifestation of American ideology, the belief that no problem was insurmountable, if you had the guts to face it and the brains to figure it out. August 17, 1943, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, deep into southern Germany. This was the mission that would break the back of the 8th Air Force or prove its resilience. The target, ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, critical to the German war machine. The distance, 600 miles, far beyond the range of any escort fighter. The Luftwaffe knew the bombers were coming. They assembled every fighter group within range, over 300 aircraft, and they tore into the American formations with a ferocity that shocked even veteran crews. The B-17 Memphis, Belle 2, not the famous Memphis Belle, but a bomber named in her honor, was hit 17 times in the first 30 minutes over the target. Flak shredded the right wing. Cannon fire took out the number 2 engine and a 20mm shell exploded in the radio compartment, killing the radio operator instantly and wounding the navigator. The aircraft began to spiral, the pilot fighting the controls, the co-pilot calling out airspeed and altitude in a voice tight with panic. Flight engineer Sergeant Theodore Teddy Mitchell was already moving. He killed the fuel flow to the burning engine, pulled the fire suppression handle, and then crawled back to the radio compartment to assess the damage. The electrical system was destroyed. Half the instrumentation in the cockpit was dead. Without electrical power, the pilot couldn't trim the aircraft, couldn't communicate with the other bombers, couldn't navigate by radio compass. Teddy had a choice: abandon the aircraft, order the crew to bail out over enemy territory, or try something insane. He chose insane. In the bomb bay, he found a spool of electrical wire, salvaged from the wreckage of the radio equipment. He stripped the insulation with his knife, spliced it into the main electrical bus, and ran a bypass line directly to the cockpit instruments. It was a jury rig that would make any electrical engineer weep. Bare wires wrapped in medical tape, connections held together with safety wire, but it worked. The compass flickered back to life. The pilot could trim the aircraft. Memphis Belle 2 stayed in formation, dropped its bombs on target, and flew home. Teddy Mitchell was recommended for the Silver Star. The recommendation was downgraded to a commendation. The official reason: unauthorized modification of aircraft systems. There is a moment in every war when the machinery of violence reveals something deeper about the societies that wage it. For the Germans, that moment came when their meticulously engineered tanks broke down in the Russian mud, and their doctrine of centralized control left field commanders paralyzed without orders from above. For the Japanese, it came when their pilots, trained to perfection but unable to adapt to American tactics, began to run out of fuel and experience, and their philosophy of honor-bound sacrifice became a strategic liability. For the Americans, that moment came in the skies over Europe, when flight engineers kept bombers flying under conditions that should have been impossible. It was a revelation not of superior technology but of superior culture. The Americans had built a military that trusted its sergeants to make life-and-death decisions, that encouraged improvisation, that valued results over procedure, and they had drawn that culture from the civilian world, from the mechanics, farmers, and factory workers who made up the ranks of the Army Air Forces. The Germans studied the wreckage of American bombers with growing confusion. They found repairs that made no sense. Fuel lines patched with rubber from oxygen masks, control cables spliced with parachute cord, electrical systems rewired in ways that violated every principle of German engineering. They found evidence of repairs made in flight, under fire, at altitudes where a man could barely breathe. And they began to understand that they were not just fighting an enemy with more resources. They were fighting an enemy with a different way of thinking. October 14, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid, Black Thursday. The 8th Air Force launched 291 bombers. 60 were shot down. 17 more were so badly damaged they never flew again. The skies over Germany were a slaughterhouse. Fighters attacked in waves, 4 and 5 abreast, firing rockets and cannons into the tight formations. Flak was so thick it looked like a black carpet. And still the bombers pressed on. The B-17 Hells Angels was hit in the first minutes over the target. The number 1 engine exploded. Shrapnel tore through the cockpit and the bombardier was killed instantly. The pilot, bleeding from a dozen wounds, kept the aircraft level long enough for the bombardier's body to be moved and for the co-pilot to take over the bombing run. Then he passed out. Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant William Billy Cross took command of the aircraft. He was not a pilot. He had no formal training in flying a B-17. But he had sat behind the pilots for 50 missions, watching, learning, absorbing the rhythms of flight by osmosis. He slid into the pilot's seat, blood-soaked and shaking, and flew the aircraft home. On one engine, through a sky full of fighters, for 400 miles. When Hells Angels touched down at RAF Bassingbourn, the ground crew counted 187 holes in the fuselage. The tail gunner had been dead for 2 hours, frozen at his post. The navigator had held his own intestines in place with a blanket, and Billy Cross, the flight engineer, climbed out of the cockpit, vomited on the tarmac, and asked if anyone had a cigarette. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He never flew another mission. The nightmares saw to that. The tool that symbolized the flight engineer was not the wrench, though he carried one. It was not the fire extinguisher, though he used it more often than any other piece of equipment. It was the roll of friction tape, black adhesive, infinitely adaptable. Friction tape held fuel lines together. It patched hydraulic hoses. It insulated electrical wires. It sealed bullet holes. It was the universal solution to the universal problem of things breaking under stress. And it was uniquely American. The Germans had technical manuals 3 inches thick for every system on their aircraft. The Americans had friction tape. There is a photograph taken in November 1943 of a B-17 returning from a mission over Bremen. The aircraft is so badly damaged that it looks like it should not be airborne. The entire nose section is gone, blown away by flak. The number 3 engine is missing. The vertical stabilizer is hanging by a thread, and yet it is flying. The caption, written by an intelligence officer, reads, "Repaired in flight by crew. Landed safely. Crew uninjured." That photograph was circulated among Luftwaffe intelligence officers. One of them, a veteran of the Eastern Front, wrote in his report, "The Americans do not fight like soldiers. They fight like mechanics. They do not accept that a machine can be destroyed. They will repair it until there is nothing left to repair, and then they will repair the pieces." It was not a compliment, but it was the truth. February 1944. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang escort fighter changed the war in the air. Suddenly, American bombers had protection all the way to the target and back. Loss rates dropped. The Luftwaffe began to crumble under the weight of attrition, and the flight engineers, those mad mechanics who had kept the bomber offensive alive through the darkest days, became something else. Legends. They had never sought glory. They had never asked for medals. They had simply done their jobs in conditions that defied imagination, because their crewmates depended on them, and in doing so they had embodied something essential about the American way of war. Not the superiority of technology, but the superiority of trust. Trust that a sergeant could make the right decision without waiting for orders. Trust that a man with a wrench and a roll of tape could solve a problem that engineers on the ground had deemed unsolvable. Trust that ordinary men, given the tools and the freedom to use them, could achieve extraordinary things. The Germans never developed an equivalent. Their doctrine did not permit it. Their culture did not encourage it. And by the time they realized what they were missing, it was too late. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The war was over. The bombers came home. The flight engineers returned to civilian life, to garages and farms and factories, and they rarely spoke of what they had done. There were no parades for them, no monuments, no chapters in the history books. They had been mechanics after all. They had simply done their jobs. But in the debriefing rooms and officers' clubs, in the confidential after-action reports and the classified studies of bombing effectiveness, the truth was acknowledged. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe had succeeded not because of superior aircraft or superior tactics, but because of superior people. Men who refused to accept defeat. Men who believed that any problem could be solved if you were willing to risk your life to solve it. Men who carried wrenches into combat and used them like weapons. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, of a Luftwaffe pilot who was captured late in the war. He was being interrogated by an American intelligence officer who asked him what he thought of the American bombers. The pilot thought for a long moment, and then he said, "Your aircraft are not better than ours. Your pilots are not better than ours. But your mechanics are madmen. They do not understand that a machine can be killed. They do not accept death, and that is why you won." In the end, it was not the bombs that broke the Third Reich. It was not the firepower or the tonnage or the precision of the Norden bomb site. It was the idea behind the bombs, the idea that a free society, built on trust and improvisation and the refusal to accept the impossible, could produce men who would crawl out onto the wing of a bomber at 20,000 feet and fix an engine with their bare hands. The flight engineer was never meant to be a hero. He was meant to be a technician, a specialist, a cog in the machine. But war has a way of revealing the truth about people, and the truth about the American flight engineer was this. He was a man who believed in the machine, not because it was perfect, but because it could be fixed. He believed in his crew, not because they were invincible, but because they depended on him. And he believed in the mission, not because it was glorious, but because it was necessary. He was the mad mechanic, and he kept the bombers flying. In the frozen skies above Europe, where the air was thin and the flak was thick and the fighters came in waves, there was no room for doubt. There was only the work. The endless, grinding, terrifying work of keeping men alive and machines flying. And in that work, in that refusal to quit, in that stubborn, bloody-minded determination to fix what was broken, there was something profoundly American, something that could not be quantified or engineered or taught in a manual. It was the belief that freedom was worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. That democracy was worth defending, even when the cost was unbearable. And that a man with a wrench could change the world, one bomber at a time, one repair at a time, one mad, magnificent act of defiance at a time.